Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from SNSGT, I'm talking about the debut album from the Qemists, Join the Queue. Alright, next on the schedule we have this drum and bass band from Brighton. They have 3 core members with Dan Arnold on synths and bass, Leon Harris on drums, and Liam Black on guitar. And more recently they also brought in vocalists Bruno Balanta and Oliver Simmons as full-time members, though they had no involvement in the band yet back when this first dropped in 2008. I had heard of this outfit once thanks to their having contributed a remix to Hybrid soundtrack to the game Drive Club. Though I'd never been inspired to look into them further until this request came in. I was just told I was going to get some material that sat pretty close to In Silico era Pendulum, and yeah, that is in fact exactly what it sounds like. Big bombastic commercial drum and bass grooves in the same style as Pendulum, with lots of chugging rock riffs. Though unlike Pendulum, who have their one consistent frontman in Rob Swire, the Qemists bring in a lot more varied guest vocalists. And they sound even more ready-made to be placed in trailers and commercials or soundtracks to racing video games or highlight reels and that kind of thing. Their third and as of now most recent album, Warrior Sound from 2016, was released on the Fixed Music label, which seems like a perfectly fitting match for the kind of stuff they do. As a side note, I've previewed through their other 2 albums, they sound exactly like this one. Now, this is not the kind of project that's going to give me a lot to break down, so I will have to mention this one interesting thing. While I was researching this band, I did note a fairly wide breadth of divided opinions from the professional critics. Most of them received it at least decently well, if you were really on board to the point where I think I saw one review calling them the future of this genre. Yeah, that didn't really pan out, did it? But what caught my eye a lot more was Pitchfork's review, because they scored it a 2.9 out of 10. That review was kind of wild to read. They were basically just criticizing this rock-influenced drum and bass album for having rock influences. Apparently the person who wrote it isn't much of a Pendulum fan, which is fair, personal taste and all. But it did strike me as almost a little weird how angry they were at the brainlessness and single-mindedness of the album. Talking about how real drum and bass has jungle breakbeats and cool atmosphere, man. It's always worse when you introduced overbearing guitar riffs and rock star attitude into everything. Okay, if you say so, Goldie. And that's not the only comments I've seen dismissing this band altogether just for the particular style they decided to focus on. I feel like I saw multiple comments from people who'd gone into this album expecting something at least marginally more highbrow, in spite of that very highbrow-looking album cover. But you know what, I might have a slight theory as to why those people might have even had those kind of expectations to begin with. I've avoided mentioning this for dramatic effect, but do you know what label this album released on? If I didn't already know, I would have guessed this came out of like a major label like Warner Brothers, EMI, Astral Works, or any of those. Maybe a marginally smaller label you'd think would fit for this kind of music, like Breakbeat Chaos, or Skint, or maybe even XL Recordings, since they had the Prodigy and Basement Jacks on them. But no, for whatever reason, the Qemists were initially signed to Ninja Tune of all labels. Now sure, Ninja Tune may be a pretty eclectic label in its own right, and they have in fact focused a lot more on like commercial pop-leaning artists in more recent years, over the traditional jazz breaks they cut their teeth on in the early days. But I still primarily associate this label with down-tempo artists like Bonobo and the Cinematic Orchestra. Even nowadays, I tend to expect artists releasing on there to sit on the comparatively chill side, kinda like Bicep, or Tycho, or Odessa. Never in a million years would I have expected a band that sounds like this to be signed to Ninja Tune. They are way out of place on that roster. I think I even saw one person on Discogs point to the Qemists signing as the point at which the entire label started to fall off entirely and enter into their current sellout period, similar to how so many people point to the band Chick 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 when they talk about how they don't like modern-day Warp Records anymore. Damn. Well, I really like the album, at least. I went in expecting something that sounds like Pendulum, and that's what I got. It's definitely not a smart or deep listen. It's pure commercial party music at best, and not designed for any kind of deeper brain usage. But, I mean, of course not all music needs to be deep or meaningful to be good. And just because a lot of this album sounds like it could soundtrack commercials and sports highlight reels doesn't mean it's inherently bad either. At the very least, these guys consistently sound like they're having a lot of fun, and the commercial focus means you're also getting really well-polished production. You'll know whether or not this album will be for you right from the opener Stompbox, which first hits you with addictingly buzzing bass lines and builds up into this crazy drum and guitar solos until charging forward into the Pendulum-style drum and bass grooves and riffs. It's pretty kick-ass, and it pretty much sets the tone for what to expect for the rest of the album. The instrumentals behind pretty much all the other tracks are going to be in that same mold, so the variety is mostly being provided by the guest features. For instance, Lost Weekend features Mike Patton from the band Faith No More and goes for more of a metal, commercial, alt-rock kind of approach. That's one of the tracks that feels more commercial soundtracky to me, especially when that hook comes in. Woohoo! I got your money! But it is still pretty addicting in its own right. And On the Run features some pretty kick-ass vocals from Jenna G, which have more of like a punchy soul kind of flavor to them. And if the female vocals are more your thing, I also quite like S.W.A.G, which features Zoe Devlin Love. Apparently she was a singer on The X Factor. This is definitely one of the most brainless tracks in the bunch. It's just about how the singer thinks you ain't got that swag, boy, and other various generic, meaningless hype phrases. Jump back a little more. But the way the track sounds musically is pretty dang cool. I really like how the singer harmonizes with herself and creates, like, some weird, mysterious, I guess kind of Western movie-ish kind of effect out of it. I don't know, especially accentuated by that 2-minute intro, which is technically separated into its own track, though you probably wouldn't notice the transition if you weren't looking at it. I quite like both the track and its intro, they're both really cool. There's also some tracks that add in some UK hip-hop influence. Dinna Like Me features some solid verses and a catchy chorus from rapper Wiley. I saw his credit here and was like, oh hey, I remember that guy. I remember everyone talking about him like around 2017, like he had a Godfather album around then. How come I haven't heard about that guy in a while? Oh, that's why. That track is still good, though. Now, as far as tracks with UK rappers on them, I think I prefer Got One Life featuring MC Navigator, which takes on a slower tempo, though goes about as hard as everything else here. And then there's two more kind of instrumental cuts here if you were sick of all the vocal guests. Tracks like When You're Lonely sounds like it's sampling some kind of reggae vocalist, but chops them up a little bit, and otherwise just hits you with all the usual propulsive drumming and wiry synth riffs. And of course we also have the closer, The Perfect High, which is the closest to ripping Pendulum-style off outright. There's a whole sci-fi narration over movie soundtrack synth strings in its intro, and there's all these high-pitched synth riffs which remind me of lots of old Pendulum tracks like Slam and Salt in the Wounds and all those. Which is not a complaint, that's a pretty epic closer. Honestly, the only track I think didn't work for what it was going for was Soundface, this minute-and-a-half long interlude featuring Beardy Man doing some beatboxing and making other weird noises with his mouth and getting processed through some filters and stuff. I guess it still fits tonally with the rest of the project, but it is a moment where the album momentarily drops its momentum and takes a slight detour that's honestly a bit more on the annoying side than anything. But that's literally everything I have to break down in Join the Queue. On one hand, I do understand the people who don't fuck with this. I mean, the Qemists have not exactly had the long-term historical staying power in people's minds that Pendulum have. And I do think that is for good reason, but that's not because they're just shallow rip-offs of a better band. They do have enough of their own spin on this particular style that allows them to not step on their toes and be, easily recommendable to fans of Pendulum. I see them more as the same step down from Pendulum that a band like the Propellerheads are to the Chemical Brothers. They're a lot more of a product of a specific time and feel more commercially trendy, which has led them to having a shorter shelf life and end up not being brought up nearly as often nowadays. Even if you can still go back to them and see exactly why they were really popping off in the moment. This kind of hedonistic party drum and bass isn't really in vogue anymore like it was around the late 2000s and early 2010s, but it does still hold up in its own way. I was listening to this album while watching a bunch of people doing speedruns of Marble Blast games and was surprised on how well it fit. I also think this album holds up much better than the similarly dated Escape from Planet Monday by DJ Fresh, even if this album doesn't have an individual moment as stellar as Closer, and there are other various high points on that album that probably beat out the best moments from this album as well. Join the Queue doesn't have any moments that I was cringing at or that had me completely baffled as to why the fuck did you execute it that particular way. I'm more likely to just return to a couple of specific tracks from DJ Fresh's album, while with this one I'm much more likely to put on the whole thing from front to back. Also, the production here is way better. So take that all as you will. Join the Queue is not gonna be everyone's cup of tea, and it was clearly never the future of drum and bass by any stretch. But I had a lot of fun with it. I never got sick of it through all my listens of it. I think I'll just let it off with a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. So leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporter. Throw out some people you want to add yourself that list. Links to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.